I just appreciate you being with me so very, very much in our study of 1 Corinthians chapter 15. So this motif of suffering is extremely, extremely important. And we must keep it within the context of the suffering of the apostles. Remember what Paul said? God has set forth us, the apostles, last of all of men condemned to die. Now, Paul's language there is taken from the Roman world and what was known as a Roman triumph. When a general, a king, or whatever, Roman, went out and he went to war and he won, he would bring the captives that he had back into Rome and they would have a great big parade. And beginning with the very first of the captives, they would have, the slaves, the poorest, etc. And then they would go up in importance until at the very, very last of the parade, you would have the captured princes. You would have ultimately the kings. And what they would do with them, depending on their mood that day, they would take every 10th person up to the Capitoline Hill and toss them over a bluff, and they would fall hundreds of feet to their death. And remember, here is Paul using that very imagery. And he's saying, we the apostles are the last. We're the last in the chain of martyrs. Again, not in the span of time, endlessly, but rather in the filling up of the measure of the suffering of Christ that Paul said, I rejoice in my sufferings for you, and I fill up in my flesh what is lacking in the sufferings of Christ. We, the apostles, have been set forth last of all. Now watch, Peter agreed with this. In 1 Peter, Peter's writing to the diaspora. Peter says, beloved, 1 Peter chapter 5 verse 1 Peter 4 verse 12, beloved, do not think it strange concerning the fiery trial. The proper translation is among you. It's not in the future tense. It is in the present active. Do not think it strange concerning the fiery trial, which is to try you, which is trying you, as though some strange thing happened to you. But rejoice to the extent, watch this, that you may be partakers of the sufferings of Christ. That when, watch this, when His glory is revealed, you may also be glad with exceeding glory. If you are reproached for the name of Christ, blessed are you. For the Spirit of glory and God rest upon you. On their part He is blasphemed, but on your part He is glorified. By the way, this is temple imagery. He is saying that the diaspora, as they are suffering for Christ, have the Shekinah glory of God resting on them as the temple of God that he had talked about in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 4 and 5. Now that pretty well means it's not a physical temple, doesn't it? Anyway, he continues, let none of you suffer as a murderer, a thief, and an evildoer, or as a busybody in other men's matters. Yet if any man suffers as a Christian, let him glorify God in this behalf. Now watch. For the time has come. For, that's a connective particle. For the time has come for the judgment to begin at the house of God. Wait a minute. What judgment? Well, he uses what's known as the anaphoric article, which refers to the previous discussion of judgment. Well, what is the previous discussion of judgment? It is verse 5, Christ was ready, Greek word hitoimos, meaning temporally ready and morally prepared, ready to judge the living and the dead. Wait a minute. The judgment of the living and the dead is the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15. Here is Peter writing about the suffering. He's an apostle. He's suffering in the suffering of Christ just like Paul was experiencing the suffering of Christ. The apostles, i.e. Peter and Paul included, were set forth by Christ as the last to die in filling up the measure of the eschatological suffering. Oh, and by the way, notice in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8, be sober, be vigilant, for your adversary the devil walks around seeking whom he may devour. Resist him, steadfast in the faith, knowing that the same suffering, what suffering? The sufferings that they were enduring at that present time are being experienced. Well, the word experience there is not the happiest translation in the world. It is epitaleo, and it means being filled up. Here is Peter with his audience, filling up the measure of sin. And by the way, he assured them in 1 Peter chapter 1, 5 and following, they would only have to suffer for a little while. Oh, what would happen in a little while? Well, he says the glory of Christ would be revealed. And he says the time for the judgment and the living and the dead had arrived, just like Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. They were suffering. He was an apostle. The apostles were filling up the measure of sin. And he wrote to the Corinthians and said, brethren, not all of us will die before the resurrection. So Paul and Peter agreed in their doctrine of the suffering of Christ, in filling up the measure of the suffering of Christ, and the fact that their vindication and their glory. Here once again, we have the shame versus glory motif, and it was coming in a very little while. That means the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15, in the discussion of which Paul introduced the doctrine of martyrdom. That meant that resurrection was coming before all of that generation passed away.